This is the podcast overview for Chapter 9, Motivation and Emotion Objectives. We'll start by defining motivation and distinguishing between what is intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So, factors that internally motivate us, and then factors that we need external motivation for. And so some of this is going to be a little bit reminiscent of the learning chapter. We talked a little bit about reward and punishment, which is linked to extrinsic motivation. So that might also be actually a good chapter to go back and just kind of look at that and see how it relates to extrinsic motivation. But you'll be learning more in this chapter about what types of motivation propel people forward, and what works and what doesn't work. And then identifying the key elements of the early instinct and drive reduction approaches to motivation. So these were early theories about what motivates us. Largely early on in psychology, we looked at instincts, as kind of primal motivators for behavior. We have instincts to eat, to ward off predators, to nest or protect our young. And so a lot of these biological instincts can prove as motivation for a behavior. And then drive reduction approaches really looked at, the motivation to reduce any type of stress or mounting pressure or frustration that we might feel, and we want to get rid of that. And so it got kind of labeled as drive reduction approaches that motivate us. We'll also be looking at the characteristic of needs. There's a lot of Maslow in here. So Abraham Maslow was a big name in psychology, especially with the field of motivation, but also in counseling psych. We learn about him as a humanistic psychologist who was always striving to understand where people wanted to go and who they wanted to be as primary motivators to achieving their goals and achieving what he would call their best possible self. So we're going to learn about this here and now, but then you'll also be revisiting this when we get to the chapter that deals with mental illness and therapy. His is a big type of therapy that we'll be looking at later on. So you'll be looking at the different types of needs that people have, and then key elements in arousal and incentive approaches to motivation. What arouses us? What provides incentive? Again, these are two more factors that play into one's motivation. And then specifically, we'll narrow down on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So what are basic needs all the way up to what are aspired needs that we have that if they're not met, we'll still survive, but we could thrive if they are met. And then self-determination theory, Deci and Ryan's self-determination theory as to explaining motivation. So those are big kind of overarching models in the area of motivation that we'll be looking at. So, really to pick this apart, you're going to have several different elements underneath these to help explain those. Then identifying some of the physical and social factors that influence hunger. Hunger is a drive, hunger is a motivator. Recognizing some of the factors that go along with it that now are contributing to obesity. It's those drives, it's those motivations that are propelling us towards unhealthy states, as we are the most obese nation in the world. And so, what's playing a role there? And then, so that covers sort of that whole first, a little more than half the chapter is on motivation, and then we get into emotion. So then, what are the three elements of emotion? And then looking at some theories of emotion, common sense, James Lang, Cannon-Bard, and facial feedback theories. Those are kind of the four big categories that we'll look at, and what each has to say about how we experience emotion, how we express emotion, as well as how we read emotion on others. We're looking at some key elements in cognitive arousal, as well as cognitive mediational theories of emotion. So here is the thinking part behind emotion. So how do our thoughts contribute to the things that we feel, and how do the things that we feel then spawn or spur our thought patterns? So it's the cognitive aspect of emotion. And then lastly, possible barriers and benefits to implementing a personal system to manage your time and tasks. So this is time management stuff, which you've probably gotten in some other areas, but it's largely tied into motivational factors. If we can be better time managers, we tend to be more motivated and less driven by stress and anxiety and so forth. So that wraps up chapter 9 for the year objectives.